Well, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to begin speaking, but I will assume that the answer is yes. And so thank you, everyone. My greetings again, and I thank you for your attention, and I apologize for my need to speak in English. I will be talking about Taiji and mental ability in healthy older adults. And in doing so, the focus will be on normal, healthy older adults who are aging normally. So this would be normal cognitive aging, people who don't have dementia, who don't have mild cognitive impairment, where the underlying assumption is that there are abnormalities in the brain due to Alzheimer's disease, due to vascular changes, and so forth, even though these are very important areas and are being investigated by people interested in Taiji. In talking about healthy aging, the concept of cognitive reserve is very appropriate. It's a term that implies a greater capacity or efficiency or redundancy in terms of brain areas and nerve pathways used during cognitive performance. And the thought is that an activity like Tai Chi, to the extent that it is able to improve mental ability, is doing so through cognitive reserve, through increasing cognitive reserve. So my colleagues and I several years ago were interested in what had been done already in terms of interventions during late life that had the potential to benefit cognitive aging by enhancing cognitive reserve. And we were interested in modifiable risk factors that were under a person's individual direct control that might be implemented during midlife or during old age, not during childhood or some earlier period of life. And so in undertaking this review, we were interested in publications that dealt with healthy adults who were midlife or older, who did not have dementia or cognitive impairment. We were interested in publications that focus on randomized clinical trials, because this kind of experimental research provides the strongest evidence of a causal link. We were interested in trials that included neuropsychological outcomes of cognition. And we were interested in trials that were of at least 6 months duration, because the effects that are most important are those that are sustained over time and not just short-term effects that may be transitory. We also restricted our analysis to trials that included at least 50 people in the 2 control groups. This is a fairly small number, but we thought that any smaller than this would lead to publication bias, because smaller studies that don't show very much are unlikely to be published, and larger trials are more likely to be published, whether they are positive or negative. And so in looking at the interventions that were of interest at the time, this is a list we came up with. I won't read through the entire list. I think now there will be some others on the list, some other interventions that we might consider. I'm sure all of you can think of others that you might be interested in. But one of the categories was mindfulness. And under mindfulness, we considered meditation, Qigong, Tai Chi, and yoga. Now, the restrictions I told you about a few minutes ago in terms of size and duration and so forth aren't very draconian. They're pretty reasonable. But that said, there have actually been very few published trials that met the criteria that we were interested in. There had been a meta-analysis done recently on aerobic exercise and mental activity, so we didn't look at that specifically. But in terms of the other outcomes, you can see the number of trials that met our criteria. For some of these interventions, there were none. Others, there were only several. And for mindfulness, for meditation and Qigong, we didn't find any trials which at that time met our criteria. And for Tai Chi, there were only 2. So, so our analysis then were based on these 2 published trials. And this is what we found. This was a network meta-analysis. It was undertaken by my colleague Philippe Lehert in Belgium. And it was based on what are referred to as standardized differences. These are differences that are based on standard deviations. I think most of you are familiar with this bell-shaped curve. One standard deviation represents 34% of the population, either better or worse. And if the analogy I like to use is that of an IQ test. I think everyone is familiar with IQs. An average IQ is 100. On the IQ test, one standard deviation represents 15 points. And if someone offered me an intervention that was going to increase my IQ by one standard deviation by 15 points, I would be very, very excited. An intervention that increased my IQ by 1/10 of a standard deviation, 1.5 IQ points, I would take that, and it might be meaningful, but it would be fairly small, and something less than that probably wouldn't be important. So these are the results of the analysis that we did on the interventions that I mentioned before. Focusing on Tai Chi, we were looking at both memory and global cognition. And for memory, what you can see here is the effect size was 0.24, so about 2/10 of a standard deviation. Not large, but large enough to be interesting and potentially important. Looking at global cognition, for Tai Chi, the effect size was 0.18, about 2/10 of a standard deviation. Again, interesting and potentially important, but based only on a very small number of trials, only 2 trials. And these are the 2 trials that we analyzed at the time. One of these was an American study. It involved community dwelling older adults in California. There were 3 groups. One of these was a Taiji group, one was a Western exercise group, and another was a health education control group. This was a 6-month trial. The cognitive outcomes were fairly limited. There were just 3 tasks. And on one of the 3 tasks, the Tai Chi group did significantly better than the control group. You can see that graphed on the right-hand portion of the slide here. So on this particular task, the Tai Chi group did perform better. The other study was performed in Shanghai. It was based on community dwelling older adults. The average age was about 68 years. There were 4 groups, but the 2 that are most concerned to us are the Tai Chi group and the no intervention control group. And there were a number of neuropsychological outcomes. A number of these were positive in favor of the Tai Chi intervention. What is shown here is a rating on a Matis dementia rating score, a fairly good global measure of cognition. And you can see that the effect size was actually quite large in this particular study for Tai Chi intervention compared to no intervention. I've since identified a 3rd study that would meet the same criteria that I mentioned before. This comes from Taipei. It's a group of older adults who had experienced falls. The average age was 72. It's a somewhat larger study of Tai Chi versus strength and balance. So another physical activity intervention. It was a 6-month intervention followed by an additional 12 months of follow-up. There was only one cognitive outcome. It's a pretty standard measure that perhaps many of you are familiar with, referred to as the mini mental state examination. And at 6 months, there was a difference in favor of the Tai Chi group, but it was quite small, only 1/10 of a point. At 18 months, the difference was a little bit larger, 0.6 of a point. A modest difference. It was statistically significant and suggested that the Tai Chi intervention also had a measurable effect. We've had the opportunity to conduct a clinical trial that also included Tai Chi as one of the interventions. It wasn't initially designed to be a Tai Chi trial, although in part it ended up being that way. We were interested in interventions that might enhance cognitive reserve in older adults. We wanted interventions that were inherently interesting and perceived as valuable. We thought that complex interventions would be more likely to engage different parts of the brain and therefore be more likely to enhance cognitive reserve. We wanted interventions that we thought could be sustained after the instruction had stopped and could be translated to a variety of settings that didn't require specialized equipment or specialized trainers. And we thought about including a physical activity intervention, a mental activity intervention, a combination of the 2. And our control group was a seminar group for comparison. We picked Tai Chi as the physical activity intervention, even though sometimes Tai Chi is not considered to be a vigorous exercise, and it's not vigorous, but it consumes, it is estimated 3 to 4 metabolic equivalents. And this is about the same amount of energy as brisk walking, or sometimes maybe not quite so brisk, but it's certainly a form of aerobic activity. The mental intervention that we ended up using was a writing intervention. There was a combination group, and the control group was a seminar group where participants listened to lectures by invited speakers on strategies for healthy aging. We enlisted these 4 groups. The average age was 78. So this is an older group, but deliberately so. This study took place in California. There was a 6-month initiation phase when people were exposed to the intervention fairly intensively, and then a 6-month maintenance phase where there was only a very limited amount of contact with the participants. And our primary outcome was defined as being the 6-month outcome. It was a composite of memory scores and executive function scores. These are 2 domains that are thought to be particularly affected by cognitive aging and also by dementia. So those were our composites and our outcomes. The neuropsychological outcome was consisted of the 3 tests shown here, 3 executive function tests and 3 learning and memory tests, and those tests are shown here. And these are the results during the first 6 months. You can see, looking at standardized scores in terms of change from baseline, the Taiji group did much better than the seminar control group, is shown down here. The Taiji plus writing combined intervention did about the same, and writing by itself, did a little bit less well. Over the maintenance phase, where the intervention was not taught as frequently, where there was only a little bit of sustained follow-up, there was a fall-off in performance, unfortunately. The Taiji group maintained its advantage, but it was a much smaller advantage than what was seen at the end of 6 months. So at least in the studies that I presented, why does Taiji seem to work? One, it does have an aerobic component, and there is a large literature that suggests that aerobic exercise would be good not only for the heart and general health, but perhaps also for the brain. It's certainly a form of mindfulness in all the various connotations that that term implies, and perhaps those are the most important features that made it work. But it's also an activity where people have to learn something new, so there's a learning component. And people are will often practice Tai Chi in a group. So there's social engagement that is part of this as well, although we controlled for social engagement with our control group in our particular study. So what I might conclude from all of is that Tai Chi exercises in healthy older adults may enhance mental abilities, presumably through mechanisms related to cognitive reserve, but benefit may be difficult to maintain without a sustained supporting structure, and that's something to consider, I think, going forward. There is a limitation for published studies in this area as well as related areas. It's not possible, of course, to blind an intervention like Tai Chi. Participants know they're doing it or they're not, but it is possible to blind the outcomes. Some of the studies don't do this. Studies are often plagued by high dropout rates, which challenges the validity of the scientific results. People don't always adhere to the intervention or practice as much as we would like them to. Sometimes the analysis is not based on the most unbiased approach, something we refer to as intention to treat. And many of the studies have been relatively small. So I think there isn't a need for additional research. This is something that is often said about most research that's presented, but future studies should consider larger sample sizes, adequate sample sizes, and treatment durations to answer the questions that are being posed. There should be objective neuropsychological outcome measures and appropriate to what's being asked. Some of the measures have been pretty limited in even the few published studies that I mentioned. Outcome assessments should be blinded where possible. There should be an increased emphasis on adherence to the intervention on Tai Chi and the maintenance of Tai Chi afterwards. This is actually a separate area of research, or should be a separate area of research, how to maintain and enhance adherence. The analysis should be done in an unbiased way. That's usually an intention to treat analysis. And these studies should consider secondary non-cognitive outcomes, health-related outcomes, and we'll hear a lot about some health-related outcomes during this forum, but also outcomes to help us understand the mechanisms of benefit. Is it related to aerobic activity? Is it related to some aspect of mindfulness, and so forth? And so with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I thank you for the invitation. I would like to acknowledge the staff and instructors who took part in our study that I've mentioned here, and particularly Master Shudong Lee, who is the co-host of today's forum. And with that, I thank you for your attention.